Welcome to our SeniorFlix segment on grief care. Grief is something that we cannot escape in this lifetime, yet when it becomes heavy and overwhelming, we find ourselves discovering that we don't have the tools to navigate. So today we are doing a series on grief care, and we have a very special guest, David Kennedy, with us. So he's been a grief counselor at a hospice in Peterborough, Ontario. He's been on faculty. He has traveled around the country doing webinars and speaking on grief. So we have the privilege to have him today. Let's welcome him. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Tessine.
Such
and
a
it's
privilege.
A delight to be here.
Likewise, it's such a privilege and an honor for me to have you here. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here and to talk to us about grief. So I'm just going to start off with this question. What gravitated you towards choosing this as a vocation?
Well, it's funny, and actually I'll just mention while you were talking, I was chuckling because you talk about my busy schedule. I'm supposed to be retired, but it seems to be busier than ever, so I'm delighted to be here. It's quite a journey, you know. You said when you started that grief is something we all experience, and that's true. And yet we have never really learned or been given the tools to deal with grief. And that's actually the key that moved me into this field. So as you know, I was teaching in an undergrad college, theological college, and you were one of my students, actually, that I'm very proud of. And it was during this time when I had to realize that I was probably in my mid to late 40s, and I had been teaching for a number of years. And one of the areas that I was responsible for was practical theology. And that was doing all the practical things in ministry. And the more I got into that world and that field and that teaching, it suddenly hit me one day that I knew everything about funerals. I know how to do a funeral. My older brother has been a funeral director for years. I knew everything there was about funerals, but I didn't know what to do with somebody a year later, 6 months later, who were still struggling with their grief. And that was a real important moment for me to realize the difference between simply going to funerals and understanding grief. And so what started that journey was that inquisitive idea of I need to learn more about grief, not just how to conduct funerals. So it wasn't an easy path because finding those programs were not easy. In fact, ended up finding one that was tied to the University of Chicago. And so I did 2 years of a program that looked at grief theory and understanding grief. And then when you finished that, there was another program in grief and trauma counseling, but you had to have this was a prerequisite, and then you had to have a master's degree to get in. And I never intended to do that part of it. I just wanted the information so that I could integrate it into my teaching. And I'll never forget they only accepted 14 people into that second program, and you had to apply by the end of June. So by about the middle of June, I got a call from the director, and she said, I don't have your application for the next program. And I tried to explain to her, well, you know, I don't really want to be a counselor. I really wanted to put this into my educational side. And the greatest wisdom was her words to me when she said, you really don't understand grief until you sit with people in grief. And that's where you learn about that. This has given you the foundations, the theoretical pieces, but if you really want to know grief, you really want to understand it, you have to be with people in grief. So I was very thankful, and my wife was really pushing me to do that. So for another 2 years, we did that, and once I finished that, to be honest, Tessine, I knew I had found my place, my world, and that was really what moved me. It was then a decision to move into private counseling, which is what I did for a number of years. And then the position at hospice opened. They were looking for a bereavement person to organize and develop all their grief pieces, which I started in and ended my working career in that field. So a little bit of a circuitous journey, but one that it started with the realization that, yeah, I know everything about a funeral. I've been lots of funerals, but grief is something different that we do not talk about and that we never have a chance to learn.
Well, David, thank you so much for sharing that journey of how you got started into the world of caring for people who are dealing with grief. I've had the privilege to sit under your teaching and be coached by you. And I think of you as a surgeon who's able to just zero in when someone is dealing with grief. And something you said made me realize that that's what you've been doing. You've been sitting with people who've been in grief. So with all the theoretical knowledge that you got and that piece together, you've developed some really keen insights on processing grief. So why don't we unpack today on maybe just give us a general idea first about how do you see grief and what is grief?
So there are three terms that often we hear, and we often think they're interchangeable when they're really quite different. And it's important as we have our conversations that people understand when I use a term what I'm meaning by that term. So that's a good place to start. So the three terms that often we are aware of are the words bereavement, grief, and mourning. And I think we need to begin by looking at those three terms and how they relate. So if you think about bereavement, that term, it's like an umbrella. It's the overarching term that speaks about a person who has experienced a loss. And that bereavement term is simply something that is a category for people to be in. So if somebody has died, you say, oh, they're bereaved. It doesn't have to be death, as we'll get to later, but let's begin with death. So bereavement is that overarching term. Grief is what happens to you when that loss happens. And you don't get to choose. Now, this is the key point. People try to manage grief. They want to change grief. They don't like what grief is. The truth is, and this is what I say to them, you can't manage grief. It manages you. Grief comes overwhelming. And it comes in so many ways to different people. It's never the same. There are certain things that we can expect, but everybody will go through that grief a little differently. But grief impacts us in every area of our life. It physically, it's social, it's spiritual, it's cognitively, it's behaviorally. So grief is what happens to you when you experience a death loss. And you can't control it. You can't say, I don't want that. I'll never forget, people would come to sit with me and they would say things like, I just want to stop crying. I don't like crying, which is a grief response. It's one of the physical grief responses. And my response to them is, you may not want that, but that's what grief is doing to you at the moment. So trying to fight that is not going to be helpful. The third term is mourning. M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. So mourning is, how do I outwardly express what grief is doing to me inwardly? And this is where the problem is. The problem isn't grief. The problem is in our willingness and our ability to find a way to mourn what is going on inside. So mourning looks like all kinds of things. It looks like, in some ways, just crying. Mourning looks like, I don't want to be with people. I want to be with people. Mourning looks like I'm sad. It looks like all kinds of emotions. There are rituals of mourning. That's what we're most familiar with. So that's where the funeral, celebration of life, those are all part of mourning experiences where we publicly express what this loss is doing to us. And that's the only piece of this that we can control. I can't control what grief does. I can control how I respond to what grief does. And in our culture, we have shut down the mourning. Many cultures in the world, mourning is something that people want to experience. So I think of European cultures where they will wear black or they wear an armband. Jewish religious cultures have ways in which they mourn. So they sit what is called Shiva, which is a 7-day period where they can't go out of the house. People come in. They have all kinds of mourning rituals. But we've really shut that down to our detriment. And people feel like I'm grieving and I just have to hold it in and I can't express it. When in fact, the only way to help our grief move along is finding good mourning. So those three terms, bereavement, the overarching term, grief is what happens to you because of the loss, and you don't get to say what that looks like. Mourning is the only control we have to take what has happened to us and find a way to express that outwardly. And there are all kinds of things that fit into that. And you're right, Tessine, sitting with, and I can imagine it's in probably the thousands and thousands of people I have sat with and heard stories that have taught me about grief and what that journey looks like, and not to be, not to make a judgment that there's this way is how you do it. It's we have to find our way, and that's the good term for me.
So I love how you've categorized those three terms, because I think sometimes we tend to see mourning and grief as interchangeably.
Right.
So we think we can process grief, but what you're saying is that grief is something like an ocean where we're just dropped in and we don't have any control, but mourning is what we can navigate.
And that's our control. And that's the piece that unfortunately people are not wanting to express. So again, I'll use that example. I remember one woman who was in her 80s, and she came to see me, and she said, "I'm here because I can't stop crying, and my children, want me to stop crying. They don't like it when I cry." And so we talked, and I said it was her husband who had died, and he had died a month earlier. And so I said to her, "How long were you and your husband together?" "Oh, we were married for 52 years. Wow. So I said to her, "Is it fair for you to think you can stop crying when you've been together for 52 years, that should stop after 1 month?" Those expectations. So what we're uncomfortable with, Tessine, in our world is we're uncomfortable when people express mourning, which is what they need to do with their grief. Yes, you won't always cry, but you'll cry now, and you should cry. And 52 years doesn't get fixed in a month. Which brings about the other piece of grief that I really want to make a point on, and that is that people see grief as something wrong with them.
So let's continue that conversation in our next segment. David, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. I just want to extend that gratitude on behalf of SeniorFlix, and I look forward to our next session and diving into that question.
Thank you.